Hello, people. Welcome to presentation number 5, broadcasting to you live from Rexburg, Idaho, where I'm up here with my 5 little grandkids and their mom and dad enjoying some time away. Hope you had fun with Mr. Denny today. I heard some interesting stories of how class went and talked to a couple of you and proved to you that I was in full uniform even while I was away. So let's get started talking about presentation number 5, when the colonies were moving from being part of the British Empire to their independence. The British colonists felt a new sense of importance after the French and Indian War. They were used to the method of fighting that had been used during the French and Indian War, and the British soldiers were not. The British were not accustomed to fighting on the frontier, which required a less formal or traditional style of fighting. Also, many of the colonists, New Englanders and others, especially up in New England where there was a lot of really staunch religious people, were disgusted by the British cursing, breaking of the Sabbath day, and other practices that were common among the British soldiers. Washington gave multiple accounts of the repulsive manners of their British counterparts. Also, the British officers used brutal punishments on their men, and American identity and pride was beginning to emerge among the colonists at this time. At the end of the French and Indian War, Great Britain had doubled its holdings in America, but this was a problem because they had a lot of trouble defending all the newly captured land on the north and on the east. Um, and that was problematic. They didn't have enough troops to guarantee it. The British were really displeased. There was a reciprocal unhappiness because the Americans weren't happy with the British. The British weren't happy with the Americans because the colonists refused to stop trading with the enemy while the army was fighting. They had invaded the Ohio River Valley and had continued to trade with the Indians. And now Britain was saddled by this huge war debt, and tensions mounted on both sides. They were trying to prevent them from trading with the Indians. They couldn't do it even through writs of assistance. And they were financing all of this money to help protect colonists that didn't seem to appreciate what they had sacrificed. So, who did the colonists view as their leader at this time? King George III was the king, and he had stopped the use of the Privy Council, which other kings had used up to this time to run the government of the colonies. He replaced it with an inner cabinet. He favored a group of trusted advisors to give him decision-making advice. The Whig nature of his government. Whig was a name given to those who had opposed James II during the Glorious Revolution, and they had sought for liberty. They were known for their supremacy over the monarchy. So this showed that the king was allowing Parliament, this group of an elite ruling aristocracy, to have control over the king. It was showing that it was a constitutional monarchy, and the king was beginning to lose power while Parliament was gaining power. Also, dealings with the colonists were not a primary topic for discussion in the in Parliament or in the King's cabinet. They weren't worried about it. They'd been fighting so many of these wars. The French and Indian War was the fourth war they'd been fighting in over about a century, and the colonists really didn't come into play most of their discussion. The colonists were only discussing; they were an afterthought, and were inconsistent and forceful, inconsistent in their enforcing of what needed to take place in the colonies. Newly acquired territory from the French and Indian War created more conflict between mother country and the colonies. Great Britain wanted to keep the colonists out of the newly acquired lands from the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which we talked about in last presentation, and hopefully you talked about in class a little bit. Native Americans, who had been on the side of the French in the war, continued to be hostile to the British colonists. To avoid more uprisings, to pacify the Indians, the king signed the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which drew an imaginary line along the Appalachians, and the colonists were forbidden to cross that line. Not all of the colonists followed that declaration. And by 1774, colonists, spearheaded by people like Daniel Boone, who's pictured here, cut the wilderness road through the Cumberland Gap. And once that road was passed through the Cumberland Gap, the idea that they couldn't settle past the Appalachian Mountains disappeared in the minds of the colonists. George Grenville, who was the prime minister at the time, was charged with paying down the tremendous debt incurred in defending the colonies during the French and Indian War. Great Britain saw nothing wrong with requiring the American colonists to pay a small portion of the cost of the defense. These are really important, these acts, so make sure you take note on what I'm explaining on them. The Sugar Act of 1764 was enforced to prevent colonists from trading with the French sugar islands. It raised the costs on imported sugar, but it also raised the cost of other goods being imported from other countries, such as textiles, wine, coffee and indigo. The Currency Act, also passed in 1764, prohibited the colonists from printing money. This was a challenge because there was a shortage of coins at the time, and hard money. There was a shortage of coins and of hard money, and their economy was suffering because nobody had any money to use for investment purposes. In 1765, they passed the Stamp Act. The Sugar Act would only help with part of the cost of maintaining British troops along the frontier in America, so Grenville pushed for the Stamp Act, was passed on February 13th, 1765. This meant that the colonists had to buy revenue stamps for their legal documents and printed material on pamphlets, newspapers, almanacs, bonds, leases, etc. This was primarily passed to help stop the printing of colonist supporting newspapers in the New World. Because if the newspapers had to have a stamp and you had to pay a tax for it, people were less likely to buy it. However, it had the opposite effect. The Quartering Act of 1765 required the colonists provide supplies and lodging, like vacant inns or buildings for the troops who were living among the colonists in Boston. The colonists believed that they were part of a special relationship with the king, and Parliament did not have control over them. Parliament, like I said in the slide previously, was overstepping the king. It was becoming less of an absolute monarchy and more of a constitutional monarchy. They believed they were outside Parliament's control. They thought that they should make these choices for themselves on how they were going to be taxed and how they were going to be paying the debt back. The colonists vigorously protested the new taxes and the assertion that Parliament had authority to tax them. They began repeating the now famous slogan of no taxation without representation. They refused to buy the items that were taxed and instead made do without or bought smuggled goods. The Sons of Liberty, who were led by Samuel Adams, who were colonial militants who would make demonstrations as to their displeasure with the Stamp Act. They hung an effigy, which is like a stuffed dummy, of the Boston stamp agent on what they called the Liberty Tree, and later the stamp office was destroyed by a mob and the homes of other officers were sacked. Colonists began to meet in their assemblies, in their meeting places. The Virginia House of Burgesses, which was where Patrick Henry gave his inspired speech we're going to be reading in our document booklets, were among the first to make resolutions against the Stamp Act. In essence, they voted out the Stamp Act. Massachusetts House of Representatives invited delegates to discuss the situation, and they invited it to discuss it in New York because all of their rights had been suspended when the Dominion of New England had been put together. 9 colonies responded to Massachusetts' call to meet in New York, and they all sent delegates to the Stamp Act Congress in October of 1765. They issued the Declaration of the Rights and Grievances of the Colonies, which was a petition to the king, and they decided that Parliament did not have the right to regulate colonial trade, but they had no right to. They did have the right to regulate colonial trade, but they didn't have any right to levy taxes. So that's where the rub was. They could regulate the trade from England, but they couldn't tax it from England because they had the right to pass their own taxes. That should be done with their own representatives in the colonies. Eventually, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but issued the Declaratory Act, which affirmed their right to tax the colonists. After the fall of Grenville, a series of new governments were formed. During William Pitt's tenure, Charles Townshend became Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is the Treasury. Townshend tried to repay the debt incurred during the French and Indian War, by passing a series of acts called the Townshend Acts. The Revenue Act of 1767 levied fees on imported glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea, which may become important here very soon. He also set up a board of customs commissioners in Boston, and this board became better known for its smuggling than it did for enforcing anything from Britain. Acts did increase British revenues, but protests erupted in the colonies, resulting in the formation of the Sons of Liberty. Daughters of Liberty as well were formed, but they boycotted the British goods. Samuel Adams, who was a distant cousin of John Adams, organized protests, wrote articles and letters. The royal governor called Samuel Adams the most dangerous man in Massachusetts. A brief quote from Sam Adams shows that his power and influence on the people at the time. He said, "Courage, then, my countrymen. Our contest is not only whether we ourselves shall be free, but whether there shall be left to mankind an asylum on earth for civil and religious liberty." Samuel Adams was one of the primary motivators to get the colonists to fight against these acts that they deemed to be unjust against them. And then there was the Boston Massacre on March 5th of 1770. The British troops had sent to had sent those who were true to the crown to Boston to control the boycotting gangs who were imitating the merchants who were loyalists. So troops had been sent to help protect the merchants who were loyal to the British crown. On that particular day, the mob began provoking the British troops outside the customs house. They were throwing icicles, oyster shells, and yelling offenses. So who started it? The colonists started it. The colonists started it by provoking the British troops. They began knocking the soldiers with sticks, and one soldier fell, then stood up and fired into the crowd. Others fired as well, leaving 5 people dead and 8 wounded. It sent a shockwave throughout the colonies because now there were deaths and there was increasing violence. Interestingly enough, John Adams was appointed to defend the British soldiers at this time because he realized that everybody needed a fair trial, and the soldiers were vindicated and because they had not started the fight. Following the massacre, the Townshend Acts were repealed, all except the tax on tea, which the British saw as a symbol of Parliament's authority. And then there was peace in the colonies for about 2 years. Regional differences were not easily overcome during this time, which led to the formation of Vermont, which was part of the New Hampshire colony. Vermont split off, and militant groups and incidents. The Paxton Boys were one of these groups that was militant. Due to hostility with the Indians, they marched on Pennsylvania's capital and held a violent riot. Benjamin Franklin talked them into returning home and promised more protection along the border. However, there were even more issues. There were problems with the regulators in South Carolina who built up tension with mostly with the Indians. And then the North Carolinians also had abuses that they were filing with with their legislatures as well. The diversity of opinion, so we had problems from Massachusetts all the way down to North and South Carolina. The diversity of opinion in the colonies were unstable and unable to govern themselves at this point. And that's something you need to realize, is that this wasn't a group of bound together by one ideology or one problem. They all had different issues. In Massachusetts, they were dealing with the soldiers. In New York, they were dealing with banking problems. In Virginia, they were dealing with slave issues. In North and South Carolina, they were fighting with the Indians still. They were rising up against themselves, and they were fighting each other. So sometimes the colonies would have disputes, and they would start fighting with each other. They really were unable to work together. There were a lot of Tories at this time, which are Americans who were still loyal to the British Crown. This sketch here is showing Benjamin Franklin trying to protest and protect, or not protest, trying to get the Paxton Boys to step down from their protest where they massacred the Susquehannock Indians. If you look on the balcony of this, I don't know if you're going to be able to see it, but if you look on the balcony right here, here's Franklin, and he's up there speaking because he was very well respected and very wise, trying to persuade them to return home and to stop the rioting and stop the fighting, which he ended up successfully doing in the end. The crisis got worse. It got worse and worse. The colonists started getting more and more angry about all of the injustices that were being imposed on them from the crown, and especially from Parliament. The burning of the Gaspee. The Gaspee was a customs vessel that had become stuck on a sandbar while pursuing a smuggler. The colonists rowed to the ship and set her aflame. So whose ship was it? It was the British. Who burned it? The American colonists burned it. The investigation was called up because of lack of witnesses, which caused further problems. So nobody really knows what happened. They're saying maybe it was a smuggler, maybe they weren't, but the Americans burned the British ship. There were also committees of correspondence started with Sam Adams in Boston, and these spread to the other colonies. They made statements of their rights and the grievances made against them, and they started communication was circulating between the colonies, and it unified them a little bit more. And the way that this was circulated was by the press. The Stamp Act, which had been repealed, they no longer had to pay that tax, and they were able to easily get communication that was translated exactly because it was printed from Boston all the way even down to Georgia, because it had been printed in pamphlets and couldn't be misinterpreted. Lord North, who was serving in Britain at the time, attempted to lower the tax on tea, but then he required the colonists to only purchase British tea, trying to work with the colonies. So he lowered the tax. Let's say the tax was 10 cents. He lowered it down to 5 cents, but then he forbade them from buying tax from the Dutch or from the Caribbean or from the French. And the colonists feared that by allowing one monopoly, that the British were paving the way for more. So this is what started the Boston Tea Party, December 16th, 1773. A group of colonists dressed as Mohawk Indians threw 342 chests of tea overboard from 3 ships. Many, including Benjamin Franklin, did not agree with this destruction of others' goods, and the British at this point decided that they had reached the end of the rope and they were going to clamp down hard on the colonists. The coercive acts, as they were known in the colonies, the coercive acts are how they were known in Britain. They were known as the intolerable acts in the colonies, were designed to force the colonies to behave. The act stated that no longer would government officials be tried in the colonies for acts committed there. Why this was important is that means that colonial officials could do whatever they wanted in the colonies, but they would be sent to England to not be tried by a jury of their peers. They would be tried by British citizens instead of American colonials. This was unfair, and the colonists got really angry. Massachusetts Bay was closed as a port until all of the tea was paid for. The British redcoats would be stationed in citizens' homes if necessary, and finally, all officials in Massachusetts were to be appointed by the crown instead of being elected. So Massachusetts was put under martial law. They were not allowed to govern themselves, and instead they had to completely surrender to the power of Parliament and the officials appointed by Parliament. In 1774, the First Continental Congress was also held in Philadelphia, and the result was that a Declaration of American Rights was published, which declared the coercive acts null and void. Essentially stated that England couldn't enforce it. This Declaration of Rights says the colonies have rights, and Britain can't enforce their law in the colonies because they've taken away the colonies' rights, especially in New England, to govern themselves. And then it all begins. When Royalists heard of a supply depot in Concord, Massachusetts, the Redcoats were charged with seizing it before the arms could be used against them. So the Tories, those who were officials in the colonies, found out they had all these weapons at Lexington or at Concord, and so they told the troops that it was their job to go get all of these ammunitions and supplies. Thanks to the midnight ride of Paul Revere and William Dawes, the Redcoats were met in Lexington by colonial Minutemen who held their ground. Whoever fired first will never be known, but the Redcoats were forced to retreat back to Boston under continual sniper fire. So the first shots of the Revolutionary War were fired at Lexington as they were getting ready to defend Concord and the supply armory there. On the same day that Washington was appointed to be the Continental Army commander, the Battle of Bunker Hill occurred. Although it was a win for the Redcoats, it was so costly that no British general would again launch such an assault. 3 major British generals and their troops led an attack on Bunker Hill using all of their artillery, and they burned down the Charlestown Peninsula. They tried 3 times to get across. They were finally successful on the 3rd attempt, but they lost so many lives and ammunition in the process that they decided they would never have such an onslaught as that. Bunker Hill battle actually took place on Breed's Hill, which doesn't really matter to anybody but those who live on Breed's Hill. More of this written work, published by John Adams and some of the revolutionaries, was changing hands, including the most powerful work at the time, which was Common Sense by Thomas Paine. In that work, Paine argued that the fall of the American Revolution lay at the feet of King George III and his advisors, and that the colonies, as a result, should consider independence. Thomas Paine's writing was so influential on the colonists. The common sense of the matter to Paine was that King George III and his advisors bore the responsibility for the malevolence toward the colonies. Americans should consult their own interests, abandon George III, and declare their independence. He said, quote, "The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, 'tis time to part." And these words by Thomas Paine were read throughout the colonies and made a lot of people who were on the fence about the issue realize that maybe it was time to initiate their freedom. 100,000 copies of Common Sense were sold. George Washington made this comment: "Common sense is working a powerful change in the minds of the men." During the summer of 1776, the delegates for the Continental Congress reassembled. This was for their second time in Pennsylvania, where Richard Henry Lee reintroduced to the Congress a resolution calling for the independence of the American colonies. Jefferson's Declaration of Independence read as a list of charges against the action of King George III that led to the Revolution. In conclusion, the Declaration said that the colonies were free and independent of British rule and were from then on a League of United States, not colonies. That change of terminology from being a colony to a state was um, just showing their desire for independence. On July 2nd, 1776, John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail that this date will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. On July 4th, when the Declaration of Independence was finally adopted, um, it wasn't ratified until August, but this is a preview of the things that we're going to see of these great men who were willing to stand and put everything on the line, um, and risk basically everything so that they could be independent and have freedom and govern themselves. Uh, we will talk a lot more about that when we talk about some of the documents we're going to read for this presentation. But what I would like you to do is come to class with really good notes, come to class familiar with the material, come to class understanding why the colonies wanted their freedom, some of the major events that had led to them getting their freedom or getting the desire for their freedom. Your notes will be checked in class, and we will also be taking an essay test. So come prepared and ready to go. I'll see you when I get back to Arizona.